whether they can't win elections because people are fleeing blue states for red states, and they can't win elections because in the census, they are counting illegal aliens as part of congressional districts, which Democrats are opposed to taking out of that because they need them for congressional representation. So when they crack these districts,
and black voters in South Carolina,
they can still vote
Tennessee,
wherever they want. You just don't draw the lines based on race, which is racist. They're desegregating the South.
You're being purposefully obtuse, and your viewers can see that because they know exactly what it means when you crack a district from a jurisdiction where there are overwhelmingly black or brown voters, and now all of a sudden those districts are cracked into 3 other districts so that their voting power is diluted.
In today's video, Brian Tyler Cohen goes directly at MAGA host Katie Pavlich during a heated clash on News Nation over gerrymandering, voting rights, and minority representation. As the debate escalates, Katie Pavlich keeps trying to reduce the entire issue down to drawing districts based on race is racist, while Brian Tyler Cohen pushes back by pointing to the actual history behind the Voting Rights Act and why these battles over district maps became such a massive issue in the first place. Because for a lot of people, this debate is bigger than just politics. It's about whether communities can still lose political power through map manipulation, even when nobody is technically being blocked from voting anymore. So let's get into it and watch how Brian Tyler Cohen pushes back against Katie Pavlich during this tense exchange on News Nation.
Joining us now is Brian Tyler Cohen, progressive YouTuber. Brian, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. So can you just explain to me how Democrats who are just calling to change Virginia's map are selectively being outraged about the Supreme Court ruling?
This Supreme Court ruling is basically rolling back the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think the fact that you can see Democrats applaud what happened in Virginia does not negate the outrage, the virtuous outrage over what happened at the Supreme Court. When Democrats are applauding what happened in Virginia, it is in response to a cycle that was started off, that was sparked off by Donald Trump deciding that he was owed 5 seats, entitled to 5 seats in Texas, and yet no Republicans had any issue with that. They seem to just decide that if Donald Trump calls for 5 seats in Texas, that there should be no response from Democrats. In fact, I don't remember you saying anything about there being anything wrong with what was happening in Texas. So when Democrats are applauding action, a response in California, in Virginia, that is because Republicans decided to engage in this mid-cycle redistricting and push back against this entitlement that Trump felt in the aftermath of Texas.
Well, first of all, in Texas, the redistricting was legal under their system, and it's still proportional. Let me finish, Brian. It was still legal, and it's still proportional to the presidential election results far more than what we've seen by Democrats way before Texas ever decided to do something. The Voting Rights Act.
That's irrelevant.
That's irrelevant. You don't get to say this is a better. Brian. There's nothing in the Voting Rights Act that says you can draw districts based on race, which is exactly what Democrats have been doing in order to maintain political power in Washington.
This debate really shows why so many Americans are exhausted by the entire gerrymandering conversation right now, because both parties constantly accuse each other of rigging the system, while voters sit there feeling like the outcome is being engineered long before Election Day even arrives. And honestly, Brian Tyler Cohen's argument lands harder here because Katie Pavlich keeps reducing this issue down to, well, technically it's legal, while completely ignoring why the Voting Rights Act existed in the first place. That law did not appear out of nowhere. It came after decades where minority communities were systematically losing political influence through tactics that were often technically legal at the time, too. Literacy tests, poll taxes, district manipulation, and other loopholes specifically designed to weaken representation without outright banning people from voting. So when Brian keeps bringing up vote dilution, He's pointing to something courts have been dealing with for generations now. Because the real issue is not just whether people can cast a ballot on paper. It's whether their communities still have meaningful political influence once district maps are drawn. And this is where Katie's argument starts frustrating a lot of people watching, because modern gerrymandering is not some accidental process anymore. Politicians now use insanely detailed voter data, demographics, turnout patterns, and mapping software to carve districts with surgical precision. In some places, elections are practically decided the moment the maps are finalized. And when districts become too safe politically, candidates stop worrying about general voters and start catering almost entirely to their own party's most extreme base. That's one reason politics keeps getting more polarized. Another thing missing from Katie's argument is that the Supreme Court itself has repeatedly acknowledged racial vote dilution as a legitimate constitutional issue. That's exactly why lawsuits over district maps keep happening in states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Texas over and over again. So this is not just some random cable news argument Tyler Cohen invented. Federal courts have been battling these same questions for decades. And honestly, for a lot of Americans, its legal defense just doesn't hit the way it used to anymore. A lot of ugly things in American history were once considered perfectly legal until the country eventually decided they weren't acceptable anymore.
And I want to go back to these maps because you say Texas started it. Well, New England, there are 0 seats for Republican representation on Capitol Hill, despite 40% of voters in New England voting for President Trump in the last presidential election. If you look at Virginia and the way that it was, 6-4, now it's going to be 10-1. They had to draw this weird lobster in the middle where you have all of Northern Virginia, which is very heavily white, by the way, disenfranchising voters down in Southern Virginia. There are districts now that voted 75% for Donald Trump. They're now going to be represented by Northern Virginia. They didn't vote for that. You also have Illinois, with 14 Democratic seats, 3 Republicans, when 30+% of Illinois voted for Donald Trump. So you tell me, looking at these maps, how that is a fair representation for Republican voters in states like Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, et cetera.
Right, and we can play the same game in South Carolina, in Alabama, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Florida, in Texas. You conspicuously left all of those out, but that really raises the question here that because gerrymandering is happening everywhere, shouldn't Republicans support a nationwide ban on gerrymandering? And yet, when that was put forward in 2020... Yes.
The most gerrymandered seats in America are not from Republicans, as we just showed on the maps. I want to ask you this question.
Take a look at, wait, hold on. Let me respond to what you just said. First of all, take a look at Dan Crenshaw's previous district and then tell me that gerrymandering doesn't exist in these Republican states. But second of all, every single Republican voted against the 2021 Freedom to Vote Act. Every single Democrat voted in favor of it. That would have banned partisan gerrymandering nationwide. Republicans right now have full control of government.
We all
House,
know
Senate,
that the
White House. There are no Republicans putting forward legislation. Excuse me. Let me just finish what I'm just saying.
This debate really shows why so many Americans are fed up with gerrymandering right now, because both parties constantly accuse each other of manipulating the system. While ordinary voters feel like politicians are basically handpicking the voters they want, instead of earning support fairly. And honestly, Tyler Cohen's argument connects with a lot more people here, because Katie Pavlich keeps hiding behind the idea that if something is technically legal, then somehow that automatically makes it fair. But that's not how a lot of Americans look at this issue anymore. The Voting Rights Act did not come out of nowhere. It came after decades where minority communities were systematically losing political influence through tactics that were often completely legal at the time too. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and district manipulation that weakened representation without outright banning people from voting. That's why Brian keeps pushing back so hard. when Katie acts like this is just normal politics, because courts have spent decades looking beyond whether something is legal on paper and asking whether it actually weakens representation in practice. And honestly, one thing Katie seems to gloss over is how advanced gerrymandering has become now. Modern mapping software allows politicians to use voting patterns, turnout data, demographics, and census information with ridiculous precision in some cases. Districts are designed so carefully that the outcome is practically predictable before anyone even votes. And when politicians sit in ultra-safe districts, they stop worrying about persuading regular voters and start worrying almost entirely about primary challengers from their own side. That's part of why politics keeps getting more extreme and more toxic. Another important point Brian is making here is that the Supreme Court itself has repeatedly acknowledged racial vote dilution as a real constitutional issue. That's why these district map lawsuits keep appearing over and over again in states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Texas. So this is not just some made-up partisan argument happening on cable news panels. Federal courts have been battling these same questions for decades because the issue never fully went away. And honestly, technically it's legal defense, only goes so far for a lot of people now. American history is full of things that were once perfectly legal until courts, Congress, or the public eventually decided they were unacceptable.
There's no legislation being put forward to ban gerrymandering nationwide. So you can, if you think it's such a scourge that you can point to New England and say that there are no Republican representatives, Republicans have the power right now to fix it, but they don't because they know that they benefit from it.
And Democrats are the ones who've been doing this.
Democrats don't have control of government right now. Republicans do.
I want to ask you this.
Do you support it nationwide?
I support the Supreme Court ruling because I don't believe in drawing congressional districts based on race because that's racist. Can Democrats win?
Because you want.
I have a question.
Wait.
Brian, do you believe that Democrats can win?
You think it's racist to have representation?
The Supreme Court just desegregated
you
the
think
South.
Having one
Democrats
district
in the South were segregating the South by having race-based congressional districts, which the Supreme Court just ruled against. That's what just happened.
So
Democrats
when they
apparently
crack
can't
these
win
districts,
elections unless they draw districts based on race. Whether they can't win elections because people are fleeing blue states for red states, and they can't win elections because in the census they are counting illegal aliens as part of congressional districts, which Democrats are opposed to taking out of that because they need them for congressional representation. So when they crack these districts,
and black voters in South Carolina,
they can still vote
Tennessee,
wherever they want. You just don't draw the lines based on race, which is racist. They're desegregating the South.
You're being purposefully obtuse, and your viewers can see that because they know exactly what it means when you crack a district from a jurisdiction where there are overwhelmingly black or brown voters, and now all of a sudden those districts are cracked into 3 other districts so that their voting power is diluted. This is exactly the impetus.
I know that George Wallace and Joe Biden were against desegregation
This was exactly
and
the impetus for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was exactly the impetus for the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Brian, Tyler Cohen, thank you. Talk to you soon.
What makes this argument bigger than just another partisan shouting match is that the debate is really about whether communities can still maintain meaningful political representation once district maps start getting manipulated strategically. And honestly, this is where Brian Tyler Cohen's argument hits harder, because Katie Pavlich keeps acting like this issue begins and ends with whether something looks race-neutral on paper while completely ignoring the history that created the Voting Rights Act in the first place. That law was not created randomly. It came after decades where minority communities technically had the right to vote, but their actual political influence kept getting weakened through tactics designed to dilute representation without openly banning anyone from the ballot box. That's why Brian keeps bringing up cracking districts and vote dilution. Because if a heavily Black or Latino community gets carved into multiple districts where their collective voting strength disappears, Then simply saying, well, they can still vote, misses the entire point, and honestly, you can see Brian getting frustrated because Katie keeps reducing a complicated constitutional issue into this oversimplified. Drawing districts based on race is racist talking point. But courts have spent decades recognizing that representation can absolutely be weakened even when voting itself technically remains legal. Another thing people overlook is just how sophisticated district mapping has become now. Politicians can use voting history, census data, demographics, turnout trends, and advanced software to redraw districts with insane precision. These maps are not random anymore. They are engineered strategically. That's exactly why lawsuits keep happening over district maps in states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and South Carolina over and over again, because federal courts have repeatedly found cases where minority representation was disproportionately weakened through the mapping process itself. And honestly, this is where a lot of Americans get cynical about the entire system. Both parties accuse each other of abusing district maps, but very few politicians seem genuinely interested in eliminating gerrymandering entirely. If doing so could cost them political power, and if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.